A favorite book series of mine has one character tell another that learning history should be like hearing gossip about people you know. I couldn't agree more. The Notorious Benedict Arnold is far more in-depth than idle gossip, but is, if possible, even more engaging. Written as a blend of political thriller, war story, and action epic, this title is also a bit like the man himself, aggressively charming and unflagging in energy. Steve Sheinkin's enthusiasm for his subject is infectious. I have yet to find a reader who isn't on tenterhooks by the end of the prologue. I weigh the success of nonfiction books by how many times I have to stop in the middle of reading them to tell my roommate, my cat, or random passersby something I just learned. Usually starting with, "Did you know?" And with this book, I lost count of how many times I did that. I am extremely pleased to present a 2011 Boston Globe Horn Book Award for nonfiction to the Notorious Benedict Arnold, a true story of adventure, heroism, and treachery, published by Flashpoint, an imprint of Roaring Brook Press, edited by Deirdre Langland, and written by Steve Sheinkin.
Congratulations. Thank you. I'll put it right here for now. Thank you. That's a very flattering introduction, and thank you to Roger and the judges. This, for the obvious reasons and for a reason you don't know, which is that writing this book cured me of an obsession that was going on at least 12 years, and I'll tell you an abridged version of that story. It really began, well, I mean, I do a lot of school visits, and I ask kids about, what do you know about Benedict Arnold? And every time it's, traitor, that's the one thing. And that's really all I knew going back to about 12 years. And I picked up a book about him, just interested, and read it. And I was just blown away that it was an action story and a romance and a spy thriller and all these things. And I said, how did I miss this? So I did at that point two things that I can see now are very typical of my nature. I ran out and got everything there was about Benedict Arnold. I think other writers will relate to both these things. Read all of these things obsessively. But then, too, instead of just enjoying this great story, I started tormenting myself saying, I've got to do something with this. You know? Do you know that feeling? I've got to do something. I've got to make this my own. And at the time, my first thought was a novel. I fancied myself a novelist, and I was going to write this as a novel, and some kind of comic novel, and it was going to have something to do, I knew, with Lancelot, the Arthurian knight. That's all I knew. And I'll read you the very beginning, because I saved it. It's short, don't worry. It goes, Lancelot, the famous knight of King Arthur's Round Table, grew up beneath the waters of an enchanted lake. Benedict Arnold grew up in Connecticut. And that's it. That's as far as I got. So that was like the first 2 years right there. And I don't know, I was so intimidated by the quality. There are actually a lot of very interesting parallels we could talk about later if you're interested, between Arnold and Lancelot. But I was so, the quality of the facts, just the story was so great that I just had a hard time getting started. And so I would do what you do when you're a writer and you procrastinate, which is to take notes. I better read one more book. I better take a little more notes, do one more outline. And I remember telling a friend, George, about the idea and saying, this is it for me. This is going to be my book. If I can't do something great with this, then that's it. I'll know I'm not a writer. And he was very saddened by that approach. And he said, man, it's got to be your bliss. And I just didn't get that. It took me a really long time to get that. And I worked on it obsessively, really doing what I was just saying, taking these notes and not knowing how to start. But I was doing other things. I actually had a proper job and everything, and I was writing textbooks at the time, living in New York. And so naturally, when the opportunity came to write a textbook about US history and then about the revolution, I said, so this is what it was meant for. I'm going to put Benedict Arnold into textbooks in a way he's never been done. Now I did go through every existing book at that time and counted how many lines there are on Arnold, and then made an average, and it's 9. If you're interested. It's very small. And I remember what I was charged with as a writer for this particular book was you just say the same thing every time you start a textbook. This one's going to be different. It's not going to be boring. It's going to really make history come alive. So my job was to find these grabbers, which we call them little short 100 words or so, to grab kids and get them into the action of whatever that lesson was. And we were doing the Revolution, and this was my big chance. And I remember sitting down with the editors. One of them, Judy, is here tonight, and we're still good friends. And you wouldn't remember this because we did this all the time, but to me this was a big deal because this was the first time I was going to mix textbooks and Benedict Arnold. And I have this story in my notes. You can see if it rings a bell. This is my grabber. It's a cold, drizzly night in New Haven, Connecticut in January 1766. 5 young sailors hurry down a quiet street. They come to a dark house and begin banging on the front door. A 25-year-old merchant named Benedict Arnold opens the door. The men start talking all at once. Arnold appears to be growing angry. What, he cries, he's still in town? Moments later, Arnold is striding down the street and the young sailors falling in behind him. Arnold comes to Beecher's Tavern, kicks the door in, enters, takes a look around, and there, sitting at a table, is the man he's looking for. The man jumps up and stumbles toward the back door, but Arnold pounces on him, drags him outside, ties him to a post, rips off his shirt, and begins whipping him. The sailors shout, "Huzzah!" as each stroke cracks across the man's back, wet now with blood and rain. Who is Benedict Arnold, and why is he whipping this man? You'll read that story next. Now, as I recall, there was a very long silence in the room. I didn't get the laughs that time. And so I tried to fill in a few details. This is actually how it all began. This was a tax protest of sorts, so it got a little out of control. I mean, Arnold was a merchant, and this was a sailor who had informed on Arnold for importing goods without paying the British taxes. And you don't do that, obviously. And Arnold, instead of taking, well, it was a political approach of sorts. He took the man out and whipped him, and it was what made him a local patriot hero, as well as a troublemaker in the eyes of the powers that be, which were things that he would continue to be both of for quite a while. But anyway, it wasn't quite right for textbooks, is what I learned, for a lot of reasons. And what I remember, the exact quote that you told me was, "Benedict Arnold makes people nervous." And I thought about that. I said, that's right. That's what I like about him. I mean, if you think about it, I think he made George Washington very nervous. I think he made Congress very nervous. They liked him because he could win and he was doing these things, but he was very nervous-making to everyone around him. And I think that's what I love about him as a character, but it's also what sort of makes him wrong for this textbook project. So I went back to my novel, or some days it was a screenplay, something like an epic 12-part movie, possibly a graphic novel. That snuck in there for a while. And I still wasn't making headway on it, and I thought, well, what I really need to do is commit to this all the way. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to become a hermit. That was my new plan. I'm going to move to the Catskills. That's where I was going to become a hermit, and but still write textbooks because I needed the money, you know. So I'd be a hermit, writing textbooks, but in my free time, I'd really be committing to this Arnold project, which I still was convinced was going to be my great book, whatever that was going to be. So I started taking weekend trips, driving up there, and I remember, my mom is here tonight, and she's very supportive. My sisters can vouch for this, of any idea, no matter how wacky. And she came with me once, I think just for the fun of it, and now looking back, probably because she was slightly concerned that I would disappear into the mountains. And do you remember we were driving with a realtor, and he was talking about local history. And my mom said, "Oh, Stephen's very interested in history." And he said, "Yeah, really? What is he interested in?" And she said, "Oh, Stephen, who's that person you like to read about?" And I was sitting in the back like a child. I said, "Benedict Arnold." And it was that same silence again. That same, like, he really makes people nervous. And it was really true. Anyway, I really thought, at least in my mind, I was quite serious about the hermit thing. And a couple weeks later, I found a property I really liked by a trout stream. It was beautiful. And it had sort of a crumbling shack on it, which was not very practical, but I liked it. And I decided in my mind, at least, that I was going to do that and move there. But I went back to the city that night and went to a party. And it was that night that I met Rachel, my wife, who's in the back. And it was the luckiest thing for a lot of reasons that ever happened to me. But I did almost blow it, because all I did was talked about Benedict Arnold. This is like all I ever did. And I got her permission to say this. She professed herself to be a history nerd. So that was very lucky for me. So I got married instead of becoming a hermit and continued to write textbooks, but all the time I was still haunted by this idea and still working on it. And I showed Rachel several drafts, which were incredibly pretentious, I think, and I don't know, it was out of control. And the second year, we've been on a proper honeymoon, but for the second trip that we were going to go on, I suggested what we should do is take all our vacation and go on a Benedict Arnold road trip. We'll just go to all the sites that he lived and fought, which is actually mostly in the Northeast up to Quebec. So it's quite doable. I recommend it. And I was sort of 51% joking, maybe. But again, she said, that sounds great. That sounds great. And we did that. And we drove up. It's fascinating to see how he's remembered or not remembered consciously in all these places that he lived. He grew up in a town called Norwich, Connecticut. And there's a little tiny sign put up by a local jeweler in the 1930s at a house where he once lived. Well, the house isn't there, but the property. And nothing else. And there's nothing in New Haven that I saw where he lived most of his adult life. And then we followed what they call the Benedict Arnold Trail, the Arnold Trail up through Maine. In the beginning of the war, he got the great idea that he was going to lead an invasion into Quebec and capture Canada, the city of Quebec and hopefully all of Canada. So he led this incredible march of 1,000 men through an unmapped wilderness in Maine. This would be one of the greatest stories or the best known stories in American history, if not for the whole treason thing that came later. I mean, Washington never dreamed of doing anything like this. And the best part about that, I remember, was meeting people who it was called the Arnold Expedition Historical Society. And they maintain these trails, and they go out and do archaeological digs and recreate the march and the paddle. They went a lot of the way on boat. So I felt very much like, so I'm not the only one. And that felt very good. But I was still, really the upshot of that traveling, aside from the great trip, was that I had even more material now that I didn't know what to do with. And I'm going to skip ahead because I really got to wrap up the obsession to about 2008. And I was lucky in my professional life. I had started writing the kind of books I really wanted to write, which was to tell all the stories I couldn't tell in textbooks and really make history interesting for kids. And what was the most fortunate turn of events was when Simon Boughton from Roaring Brook took a liking to what I was doing and published a couple of the books. And so I was on a little bit of a roll, and I was sitting with Deirdre Langland, my great editor, right here, who I've been working with right from the start and batting around ideas. I don't know, do you remember this conversation? And we were just discussing things, and I didn't even think to bring this up, but she said, didn't you once want to do something about Benedict Arnold? And I don't know if you know what a profound effect that had on me, because it cured me instantly. It really did, because once we started talking about it, I think we saw it exactly the same way. All that nonsense, all the pretense and gimmicks that were in my notebooks just went out the window in an instant, and I just knew this had to be a straight-ahead thriller. And so that was the cure right there. And obviously there was a lot of work that went into the actual writing and editing and rewriting, but once I got the idea that this was going to be a nonfiction book for kids, and I do school visits all the time, and kids are constantly telling me how much history sucks, I knew that it was going to have to be the kind of book that convinced them, proved to them that history was cool. And so that was a big, big turning point for me. And now that I look back on it, I have a little bit of objectivity. I can wonder, what was the obsession about? And obviously, two things. One was the story, for sure. It's just a great, great story. It starts off with this angry, wounded child who's the son of an alcoholic father who runs the family business into the ground and really embarrasses the family and young Benedict. And he becomes an apprentice and works his way up to a merchant. Then when he gets into the war, he sees this as his opportunity. And he leads the march to Quebec, then this incredible naval battle on Lake Champlain, which would be another hugely famous story in our history, then wins the Battle of Saratoga, and then it becomes a romance where he meets this woman, Peggy Shippen, and a spy thriller with the British intelligence officer he's working with, and it all comes roaring to a climax in West Point, New York, which was the place that he was going to turn over to the British, with Washington sitting in the trap in West Point. So the story was one, but there was something else too, and I really had to think about it, and it goes back to the Arnold making people nervous thing. It's not that he's a bad guy, I realized. It's that he's a good guy and a bad guy. And there's something about that that makes people nervous, I think, this is a generalization, I'm not singling out any of us, but as Americans, I don't think we handle that sort of contradiction very well. And that's especially true when it comes to telling our stories of our founders and what's really our creation story. And especially when we're trying to do that for kids. We do not do a very good job of explaining or trying to explain that it's possible that the country was built on these grand and beautiful ideas while also having these very serious moral flaws built right into the fabric from the start. And I think we think that if we try to explain that to kids, they're going to be confused, less patriotic, all of these things. And I think that actually has a lot to do with why kids don't like history, because we end up simplifying, especially this era of history. And Arnold is such a beautiful example of that contradiction, that you can be, this is true of a human or a country too, that you can do great and terrible things at the same time. And so for me, it was just the most wonderful story to tell. And that's really what it comes back to, for me, is this story. So I can honestly say I was very happy to be obsessed with it, and I'm even happier now that I'm not anymore. And thank you very much.